The paperwork looked clean. The first airworthiness directive went out in August 2017, issued as an emergency. The FAA waived the public comment period because the risk to the flying public, in its own words, justified it. Owners had 10 operating hours to comply. The agency marked the defect addressed. 7 years later, the FAA issued a second directive for the same defect, this time covering an estimated 16,000 engines. 16 months after that came a third directive for the same defect. The fleet under mandate jumped from 16,000 to 45,152 aircraft. The defect did not grow. The scope of what the institution was willing to acknowledge did. That is the story of AD 2026-04-11, the Lycoming Airworthiness Directive that went into effect. April 8, 2026, placed 45,152 aircraft under mandatory oil filter inspection at every oil change, and buried a fleet-wide cost estimate in a Federal Register compliance table that has produced no headline. Have you cut open a Lycoming oil filter in the last 16 months and actually noted what you found? Leave it in the comments. Sky Ranch covers general aviation cost and regulatory reality. Subscribe if this is the kind of research you want access to. The Lycoming O-Series engine is not exotic. That is its strength. In continuous production since 1953, it sits under the cowling of the Cessna 172, the most produced aircraft in history. Its variants power the Piper Cherokee, the Robinson helicopter, the Mooney M20, and the Cirrus SR22. When American pilots learn to fly in a fixed-wing aircraft, the odds favor a Lycoming. That is not marketing copy. That is a census of what occupies general aviation hangars. For the 1,500 to 2,000 hours an average Lycoming runs between overhauls, this engine asks very little of its owner. Oil changes, spark plug rotation, filter inspections. It is not elegant machinery, it is reliable machinery built to a standard that worked for decades. A former supplier manufactured one of its most basic components to the wrong specification for 12 years and 7 months. The consequences kept expanding long after Lycoming declared the first fix complete. Inside every Lycoming piston engine, the connecting rod links the linear movement of the piston to the rotational motion of the crankshaft. At the small end of that rod sits a bronze cylinder pressed into the rod bore. This is the connecting rod, small end bushing. Its job is to carry the contact load between the rod and the piston wrist pin. It keeps metal from grinding on metal at thousands of revolutions per minute. The part that failed is bronze, press-fitted, sized to stay in place under load. A properly specified press fit holds the bushing through interference. The bushing's outer diameter is fractionally larger than the bore it enters. Pressing it in creates a residual grip that thousands of combustion cycles cannot overcome. The dimensional analogy is a rifle cartridge case sized for a slightly undersized chamber. It seats, it fires, it holds until it does not. The deviation in these Lycoming bushings removed the interference margin. The grip that once had to be permanent became conditional, and the condition it depended on was load magnitude staying below a threshold the supplier never documented. A former Lycoming supplier manufactured these bushings from January 30th, 2009 to September 9th, 2021 with undersized outer diameters. The exact dimensional deviation is not published in any public document. The result is that the bushing fits loose. Under load, it migrates. Every combustion stroke pushes the connecting rod against the wrist pin. The loose bushing shifts outward incrementally through thousands of cycles. The inner wall of the piston temporarily holds it in position so the engine keeps running. As the bushing travels further from the bore, the load-bearing surface shrinks and wear accelerates. Bronze particles break free and travel with the oil to the filter and the suction screen. That is the early warning. Miss it and the rod fails. When a connecting rod fails in a reciprocating piston engine, it does not fail quietly. The rod punches through the crankcase wall. Engine components exit the nacelle at velocities that can damage the airframe. The FAA's technical term for this outcome, uncontained engine failure, understates it. The engine does not shut down. It comes apart. The prop stops. The airplane stops climbing. At that point, the pilot is managing a ballistic trajectory, not an aircraft. The compliance threshold documented in Lycoming Mandatory Service Bulletin 480F, now incorporated into the AD by reference, is 1/4 teaspoon of coarse, non-magnetic, bronze-colored sand in the oil filter or screens. Find that quantity and the AD grounds the aircraft before the next flight, pending engine teardown or shipment to Lycoming. That is not a maintenance recommendation. That is a no-fly condition, documented in federal law, with the aircraft on the ramp until the owner resolves it. The FAA's cost estimate for that inspection is $235 per oil change per engine. That includes 2 labor hours at $85 per hour, plus $65 in parts. This recurs indefinitely at every oil change until the defective bushings are replaced. When bronze appears, there is an additional $85 per engine for a mandatory connecting rod bushing inspection before the next flight. When those bushings fail that inspection, replacement costs are $762 per bushing before the aircraft flies again. That requires 4.5 labor hours, plus $380 in parts. Per the FAA's own cost table, Federal Register, March 4th, 2026. 3 numbers from the March 4th, 2026. Federal Register that produced no headline. 45,152 aircraft on the U.S. registry are now subject to Airworthiness Directive 2026-04-11, effective April 8, 2026. $34,405,824. The FAA's fleet-wide bushing replacement estimate, if every affected engine requires replacement. This figure is derived directly from the cost compliance table in the final rule. 45,152 engines at $762 per bushing. September 9th, 2021 is the closing boundary of the affected part ship range. 4 years after the 2017 directive should have contained this problem. The 3-directive timeline reads like an institutional confession delivered in installments. August 15th, 2017, Airworthiness Directive 2017-16-11 takes effect. Emergency issuance. Notice and comment waived. 10-hour compliance window. Coverage. Parts shipped during dates. Lycoming identified from its own investigation into isolated connecting rod failures. The FAA called it addressed. June 28, 2024. The FAA published a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. Lycoming's manufacturer investigation had found the affected bushings installed on additional engine populations beyond the 2017 scope. By the time that notice published, the FAA had received at least 5 confirmed reports of uncontained engine failures and in-flight shutdowns caused by connecting rod failure. Each of those 5 events represents a connecting rod that punched through a crankcase wall on an aircraft in flight. The FAA does not publish a running total of events in an Airworthiness Directive series. The cumulative count across the 9-year period is not consolidated in any document the agency has released publicly. December 5th, 2024. Airworthiness Directive 2024-21-02 takes effect. Approximately 16,000 engines are covered. The total estimated compliance burden is $17,312,000. The FAA published the notice of proposed rulemaking 6 months earlier and received comments from one organization, Lycoming. Lycoming's statement in that process, and in every public communication since, is that this was a long-standing, comprehensive effort to address concerns created when a former supplier manufactured non-conforming connecting rod bushings. The supplier is unnamed. April 8, 2026. Airworthiness Directive 2026-04-11 takes effect. During the comment period on the preceding notice of proposed rulemaking, Lycoming requested that 3 engine series be added to the directive scope: the IO580, the IO720, and the O290. The FAA agreed. The fleet under the mandate grew from 16,000 to 45,152. The expansion language in the final rule says the ship date range for potentially affected parts has been expanded, not a new failure analysis, not an independent engineering review. The original range was wrong. Lycoming's 2026 statement is word for word identical to its 2024 statement. The former supplier remains unnamed in both. That timeline documents what the institution acknowledged and when it chose to say so. What it does not account for is what happens when an owner runs the bronze warning sequence without knowing what the reading means and departs anyway. September 2019, Fort Wayne, Indiana. The aircraft experienced engine failure in flight approximately 10 miles southeast of the city. The Cirrus SR22 sits at the top of the accessible general aviation market. Used models trade between $200,000 and $400,000 depending on year and avionics. New models approach $900,000. It is the aircraft an accomplished pilot buys when they have outgrown a Cherokee and refuse to accept that speed and safety occupy opposite ends of a spectrum. It is also a Lycoming-powered aircraft, and it falls within every version of this directive's scope. The CAPS system, the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System, is a whole-plane ballistic recovery chute. It has been deployed successfully more than 130 times since the SR-22 entered service in 2001. Its presence in the Fort Wayne incident is the reason this entry in NTSB records ends without a fatality notation. Remove CAPS from the airframe, and the outcome of a complete in-flight engine failure at cruise altitude resolves differently. The flight began routinely. The pilot noticed a low oil pressure indication. He made a precautionary landing. Maintenance checked the oil quantity, found it acceptable, made a minor adjustment to the oil pressure relief valve, cleared the aircraft to depart. 20 minutes after departure, the engine failed completely. The pilot deployed the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System, the whole-plane ballistic parachute that has saved hundreds of occupants since the SR-22 entered service in 2001. The aircraft descended under canopy and came to rest in a residential backyard. No injuries. Engine teardown, documented in NTSB Docket ProjectID, D100263, found heavy damage to the number 1 connecting rod at the piston end. The number 6 piston pin bushing had migrated out of the connecting rod bore. The failure sequence, progressive migration, load surface loss, bronze shed into the oil, had advanced to full rod failure before the pressure gauge gave its first abnormal reading. The pressure indicator responded to downstream consequence. By the time the gauge changed, the bushing had already traveled. Maintenance cleared the aircraft to depart. Nothing in that stop involved a cut filter inspection. Lycoming MSB 480F, the service bulletin documenting the bronze particulate threshold, had been published since 2017, 2 years before that flight. The aircraft that settled in that backyard had a parachute system, a composite airframe, and a pilot who acted on every visible warning in front of him. He saw the low pressure. He landed. He received clearance. What the precautionary stop did not include was the inspection the Airworthiness Directive, AD, now mandates as a condition of continued airworthiness. The parachute worked. That is the best possible outcome in this failure sequence. The service bulletin describing that filter inspection had been published for 2 years before Fort Wayne. Which concerns you more, that the failure mechanism is this predictable, or that the guidance was optional for 7 years after 2017? Leave your answer below. Fort Wayne is one aircraft. The Federal Register's cost table translates that same failure sequence into dollars across 45,152 aircraft, and the number it reaches has drawn no reporting. The FAA's Cost Compliance Table for Airworthiness Directive 2026 FAA-04-11 occupies 5 rows and 4 columns in a federal document most owners will never open. The oil inspection runs $235 per engine at every oil change. 2 labor hours at $85 plus $65 in parts until the bushings are replaced. Across 45,152 engines, the FAA estimates that inspection at $10,610,720. When bronze appears, the mandatory connecting rod bushing inspection follows at $85 per engine, totaling $3,837,920 across the fleet. When the bushings fail that inspection, replacement runs $762 per bushing, 4.5 labor hours plus $380 in parts before the aircraft flies again. Across the affected fleet at full replacement, $34,405,824. That figure is not in any Lycoming communication. The company's response to the 2026 expansion mirrors its 2024 and 2017 responses exactly. Long-standing and comprehensive effort, a former supplier, non-conforming bushings. The 2024 AD's total compliance estimate was $17,312,000 across 16,000 engines. The 2026 AD's replacement estimate alone is $34,405,824 across 45,152 engines. The gap between those two figures is $17 million. The time between the two directives is 16 months. The FAA's characterization of the 2026 expansion is that none of the changes will increase the economic burden on any operator. That sentence and the $34.4 million cost table occupy the same Federal Register entry. A second variable compounds the exposure. Owners who can document superior air parts bushing part numbers in their overhaul records, identifiable by the SL prefix, are fully exempt from the AD. The directive covers only Lycoming OEM-sourced bushings within the affected ship range. Federal regulation under FAR 145.219 requires certificated repair stations to retain maintenance records for 2 years. For engines overhauled anywhere in the 2009 to 2021 window, documentation from the early years of that range no longer legally exists at most shops. Owners who cannot produce a parts invoice specifying superior bushing numbers default to covered status under the AD. The practical affected population may exceed 45,152. Here is what the March 4, 2026 Federal Register confirms and what it deliberately leaves open. It confirms the ship date range ends September 9, 2021. 2 prior directives also carried end dates. Both moved. It confirms the bronze warning is detectable at oil change and that a voluntary service bulletin describing that detection has existed since 2017. It confirms Lycoming identified 3 additional engine series during the 2026 comment period and requested their inclusion. The document does not address what prompted that identification at that moment and not during the 2024 AD drafting. Compliance. Check the Lycoming engine serial number history search before your next oil change. If your engine shipped in the January 2009 to September 2021 window and you cannot produce overhaul documentation showing superior air parts bushing numbers, this AD applies to your aircraft. The trigger is your next oil change, not the next annual. The next oil change. Cut the filter. Pull the suction screen. Look for bronze sand. Whether the September 9, 2021 boundary holds, or whether a 4th directive will extend it again, the Federal Register does not say. 2 prior directives were each framed as the final resolution. Neither was. Was the 2017 scope an honest estimate that turned out wrong, or did it take 9 years and $34.4 million to make a service bulletin mandatory? Put your read in the comments. If Sky Ranch is where you follow general aviation cost and regulatory reality, subscribe. More research is already on the bench.